A half-dead Neapolitan Mastiff storms into the most exclusive restaurant in Chicago, collapses at a Mafia boss's feet, and boom, his entire empire starts cracking in real time. One starving dog leads to one ghosted woman, the woman leads to a hidden hard drive, and that hard drive points straight at the brother he trusted more than blood. No slow setup, no wasted breath, just stolen identities, mafia money, a death trap inside Willis Tower, and a betrayal that has been cooking for 5 straight years. The hook is savage. The man hunting the traitor still does not realize he is seconds away from being hunted himself.
The animal's appearance was a glitch in the system. To enter Solace, the Gold Coast's most impenetrable restaurant, one needed a pedigree of power and wealth that asked for no proof. But on that Friday night, a Neapolitan Mastiff, built like a small horse, slipped through a rear kitchen door. It drifted through the dining room, past stunned staff and silent patrons, its strength finally failing at the feet of Alio Valente, the one man in Chicago whose stare people actively avoided. Alio was 36 and ran a criminal empire. His operations stretched from Chicago to Miami, hidden behind a portfolio of legitimate hospitality businesses. Every Friday, he claimed the same corner table, back to a wall, a clear view of both exits, carving a steak he ordered out of habit, not appetite. This ritual had been unbroken for 5 years, ever since a 2 a.m. phone call informed him his mother died when her car was bombed outside her home in Lincoln Park. 5 years of dining in solitude. 5 years staring at nothing through a pane of glass. Tommy Keene, his head of security, drew his weapon as the beast collapsed. Alio stopped him with a single raised hand, and the motion froze the entire room. He studied the animal. It was a ruin, a frame of bones under loose gray skin, its breathing a shallow flutter, but its eyes were still open. They were a deep, exhausted brown, completely spent, but showing no fear. That was what held him. This dying creature had navigated an entire city to surrender at the feet of its most dangerous predator. Alio dropped to his knees. Placing a hand on the Mastiff's head, he felt a crack in the psychological fortress he had built for 5 years. Get a veterinarian, immediately. Tommy had never heard that tone from his boss. Not command, not detachment, but raw desperation. Alio couldn't know that the dog's arrival was not random. It was a messenger, sent by a woman stripped of everything, who carried a secret that could obliterate the one man he trusted most in the world. Her eventual crossing into his world would permanently shatter his existence. If this case file has already captured your interest, log your engagement, forward this analysis to a relevant colleague, and subscribe for all future dispatches. We now return to the moment Alio Valente knelt on the cold floor, as it represents the first fracture in his entire belief system. Dr. Petra Novak, a vet, got to Solace around midnight. She was the only person Tommy could find at that hour who handled large animals, working from a clinic a 20-minute drive from the restaurant. When Petra entered, the place was locked down and deserted. The staff was gone. Only Alio was there, sitting on the floor beside the dog, his hand never leaving its head. Tommy stood guard at the entrance, his focus more intense than for any high-level deal his employer had ever managed. Petra knelt and started her examination, working in silence for the first few minutes. She then looked at Alio with an expression he knew well, the look of an expert deciding how much of the truth he could take. The dog, she said, was starving. It had likely gone without proper food for many months. Its front left leg was swollen with a foul, aggressive infection. Without treatment in the next couple of days, she would have to amputate. And if it didn't get fluids that night, it probably wouldn't last until morning. Alio did not ask how much it would cost. He did not ask about the odds of survival. He just told her to do whatever was required. Petra began administering an IV right there on the restaurant's floor. During the wait, Alio asked about its breed. Petra told him it was a Neapolitan Mastiff, an Italian dog both rare and valuable. Someone had once poured a lot of care into this animal before it fell apart. It wasn't born astray. It had an owner. As soon as the dog was stable enough to be moved, Elio instructed that it be taken to his penthouse on Michigan Avenue. Tommy started to object, but quickly thought better of it. Two other security men, more familiar with guns and death than their boss holding a dog, watched in silence as Elio took the private elevator up, the mastiff in his arms on a blanket. The penthouse was on the 43rd floor. It was a sterile world of white marble and glass walls with a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, furnished with dark Spartan pieces, all of it expensive and cold. Alio set the dog down in the main living space. Tommy had already brought in a luxury dog bed lined with sheepskin, placing it in the warmest patch of city light. The dog glanced at the bed, then turned from it. It labored to the room's most remote corner, the deepest shadow, a place untouched by the city's lights, and lay down. It faced the wall. Elio watched. He understood completely without needing an explanation. The dog was trained to find dark, hidden places, spots where it would go unfound. It sought the shadows because shadows were the only safety it had ever known. Alio walked to the control panel and shut down every light in the penthouse. The room went black. Only a faint glow from the city filtered through the glass, enough to see shapes but not details. He sat on a sofa near the corner where the dog lay. He didn't turn on the television, get a drink, or make any calls. He just sat there in the darkness, listening to the creature's ragged breathing less than 2 meters away. After some time, the breathing deepened, steadied, and grew quiet. The dog had fallen asleep. Alio stayed awake. He sat in that same spot until the first light of dawn broke through the glass, turning the Chicago skyline from black to gray and then to a pale orange. In the last 5 years, he had spent more nights alone in the dark than he could remember. But this was the first night he had sat in the darkness and not been entirely alone. When Tommy came in the next morning, he saw his boss still on the sofa, wide awake, with the dog still in its dark corner. He asked nothing. He simply set a cup of coffee on a table and backed away. There were mental spaces that even Alio Valente's closest men knew they should never enter. During that first week, Petra Novak came to the penthouse 2 times a day to change Titan's dressings, give him fluids, and check the infected leg. The infection started to improve on the 3rd day. The dog began to eat on day 4, very slowly, as if it didn't trust the food would stay. Alio named him Titan. No one asked for a reason. Tommy simply nodded, adding the name to the list of dog supplies to be ordered. From then on, the entire crew called the animal by that name. It was during Petra's treatments, however, that Alio started noticing the inconsistencies. On the 5th day, while checking the dog's ears, Petra went quiet for too long. She called Alio over to look. Titan's left ear had an old healed scar, but the cut was too clean, too straight to be from a fight. Someone had taken a blade to the animal's ear, a deliberate move to cut out an owner's identifying tattoo. On the 6th day, Petra found the second clue. On the back of Titan's neck, buried beneath the breed's characteristically thick and folded skin, she found a tiny, healed incision from a surgery. A careful touch of the area confirmed her fear. The dog had once had an ID microchip, but the device had been surgically cut out. It hadn't worked its way out. It hadn't stopped working. Someone took this dog to a professional and paid to have the chip removed. Alio found the 3rd clue himself. One morning, with Titan lying on his side for a bandage change, Alio saw the mark that circled the dog's neck. A faint, dark line was visible where the fur was much thinner than anywhere else on his body. It was the impression left by a collar worn for a very long time, long enough to scar the skin itself before it was cut away and thrown out. Alio sat on the sofa, putting these 3 facts together, and an idea began to take shape. The ear was carved to remove a visual ID. The microchip was extracted to stop electronic tracking. The collar was cut off to hide the owner's information. 3 different actions, all with one goal, pointed to a single truth. Someone had systematically erased this dog's history. This wasn't abandonment, it was a theft, and the thief never wanted the original owner to be found. Alio called Tommy. His order was brief. Find out where this dog came from, find the person who owned him, and find out why every trace of his identity was destroyed. Tommy obeyed, but Alio could see the question in his eyes, the one Tommy was too smart to ask aloud. Why does the boss care so much? The answer, which Alio kept to himself, was instinct. The gut feeling was a familiar one. It had kept him alive for 2 decades in the shadow world of crime. When someone works this hard to erase a trail, what they hide is always far bigger than what is seen. Petra had offered the first clue. She explained that with prized dogs like a Neapolitan Mastiff, owners often hide a second microchip in an odd place, like the hip or chest, to foil professional thieves. A full diagnostic scan found it. An anomalous chip embedded beneath the skin of the dog's chest. It took 3 agonizing days to decrypt the device's identification number with the National Registry. The search returned a single name: Hazel Brennan, last known to be living in Chicago's Bridgeport district. Alio told his man Tommy to dig up everything on the woman. The file that landed on his desk 24 hours later held a contradiction so jarring Alio read it 3 times. The subject was Hazel Brennan, age 27, once a veterinary doctoral student at the University of Illinois who paid her bills working nights at a Southside clinic. 5 years back, she was formally charged with stealing controlled drugs, specifically opioids, from the clinic. This cost her the license from the state's Department of Health and got her thrown out of the veterinary program. After that, she simply vanished from all official records, wiped clean, as if she had never existed. Alio set the file on the table. He watched Titan, who had taken refuge in a dark corner, a space he had made his own since arriving. The story made no sense. A person who would choose a Neapolitan Mastiff, a massive financial commitment, and dedicate her life to veterinary science. Her profile suggested a woman whose entire purpose was animals, yet she was an accused opioid thief from her own clinic. The file was broken. In Alio Valente's mind, a break like that always pointed to a hidden story. He told Tommy to find her. It took 4 days to track her down. The delay wasn't from laziness. It was because Hazel Brennan had methodically scrubbed her existence from every database. Tommy had to go old school, hitting the streets and visiting shelters from Chicago's north to south, showing around an old photograph. A volunteer at a temporary shelter in Inglewood finally recognized her. The woman was present, the volunteer confirmed, but she kept to herself. Tommy called Alio, who ordered her brought to the penthouse. When asked what to do if she refused, Alio paused, then used his leverage. "Tell her I have her dog. Tommy found Hazel on the shelter's 2nd floor, sitting on a bottom bunk in a dorm for 8 women. She was 27 but looked 35, her thin frame lost inside a donated man's overcoat. Her auburn hair was a neglected tangle, dark circles hollowed out her eyes, and tape held her shoes together. Yet when told a man had her dog, her response was not fear or suspicion. It was a flicker of hope. It was the one emotion that had survived 3 years of being systematically destroyed. She rose to her feet without a second thought. She didn't ask where she was going or who was taking her. Her only question was, Is he alive? Hearing yes, Hazel closed her eyes for 2 seconds, then agreed. I'll go. During the ride, she sat silently in the back, her gaze fixed on the world blurring past the window. Tommy saw the pressure in the rearview mirror. Her knuckles were bone white from clenching her fists. Her silence about Alio Valente meant she either knew him or was so focused that he was irrelevant. Both ideas were interesting. When the elevator doors opened on the 43rd floor, Hazel stopped for a single heartbeat. The opulence of the penthouse, gleaming marble floors and glass walls showing the Chicago skyline, was a world that no longer belonged to her. Yet Hazel's eyes scanned the space for less than a second before a sound drew her to a dark corner, away from the city lights. It was Titan, getting up with a shudder, his front leg still wrapped. The dog hadn't moved for 10 days, not even for Alio. He turned to the elevator, his nose twitching, his whole posture changing. The tail, which Alio had never seen move, gave a slow wag that quickly picked up speed. Titan limped with determined purpose across the floor, straight towards Hazel. Hazel fell to her knees on the marble, her arms open to receive him. Titan collapsed into her embrace, his huge body trembling. She wrapped herself around the animal and cried without making a sound. There were no sobs, just tears silently falling onto the dog's coat as she clutched him. Her grip was that of someone terrified of being separated again. She whispered a broken apology into Titan's ear. I'm sorry. I looked for you everywhere. 10 feet away, Alio watched with a blank, unreadable face, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched with a clinical eye. This was not a reunion between a pet and its owner. This was someone holding onto their last anchor in the world. He recognized that desperate embrace from his own past, the last time he held his mother's coffin, trying to stop time itself. The memory was an unwelcome guest. He studied Hazel Brennan kneeling on his floor, clinging to the dog, and knew the official story was a pathetic simplification of her pain. The embrace lasted a full 15 minutes before she pulled away. When she finally stood, her face was wet and her eyes were raw, but she didn't try to wipe the tears away. With a hand on Titan's head, she looked directly at Alio for the first time. Her expression held no fear, no pleading. It was purely analytical. Alio knew that appraising stare. It was the one he used every day. Sit down and eat, he commanded, his tone flat and meant to reclaim authority. He had Tommy bring a meal. 20 minutes later, a table was set with steak, mashed potatoes, and coffee. Hazel sat across from Alio. Titan lay by her feet, his head resting on her tattered shoes. And for the first time in that place, the dog closed his eyes outside the darkness of the corner. How Hazel ate became Alio's new object of study. She did not eat fast. She did not devour the food. She cut the steak into small, precise pieces, chewed each one with care, and paused after every swallow. It was the trained response of the chronically starved, a way to keep a body from rejecting a sudden meal. A person who eats fast has been hungry for days. A person who eats this slowly has been hungry long enough to conquer that impulse. Alio knew the difference from his own youth on the South Side, when his mother fought to put any food on the table at all. He watched in silence as she finished. When Hazel put her utensils down, her eyes met his again, direct and unwavering. I know who you are, she said, her voice completely even. Alio Valente. Everyone in Chicago knows the name, and I know I don't belong here. Alio let the silence hang, giving her the floor. Hazel continued, I need to tell you something. This isn't a negotiation. It's not because you have Titan. This is a debt that I owe to him. Without this dog, I would have been dead by now. What I'm about to tell you is why Titan was held captive for 3 years. The room was still. This dog was stolen from me, Hazel said, each word precise. By Franco Bianchi's men. Alio's expression was a stone mask. Not a muscle in his face moved, but inside, his world had just fractured. Franco Bianchi. He was more than a friend. He was the brother Alio had chosen, the only man on earth he trusted without a single doubt. And they took Titan from me, she said, her eyes locked on Alio's, because I know that Franco Bianchi murdered your mother. The words shattered Alio's iron composure. He flew to his feet, the chair crashing onto the marble floor. Across the room, Tommy's hand went for his weapon. The dog, Titan, startled at the sound, but Hazel remained perfectly still. Her gaze stayed on Alio, on his clenched jaw and the throbbing vein in his neck. Her expression was one of deep weariness, but it was empty of fear, the look of someone with nothing left to lose. "Say it again," Alio ordered, his voice so low Tommy had to step closer to hear him. "Franco Bianchi killed your mother," Hazel repeated, with no change in her tone. 5 years ago, the car bomb in Lincoln Park was no accident. Franco planned it. "Proof," he demanded. Hazel gave him a slow nod. "Your mother, Renata, found out Franco was laundering Sinaloa cartel money through the restaurant chain you two owned. She had the real ledgers, taped calls with cartel men, and the Cayman Islands account numbers. She had prepared a full dossier for the reveal. But Franco moved first. Alio's eyelids shuddered for a count of 1, 2, 3. When they lifted, his face was a mask of cold predation, the very look that heralded a kill, the last thing his targets ever saw. This intel, its origin? Hazel held her answer. Her eyes flicked to Titan, her hand brushing his fur for a fleeting anchor of strength before she began. 6 years ago, she was in her final year, a candidate for a doctorate of veterinary medicine at the University of Illinois. The doctorate's cost was immense. Her own funds were a void. After her mother was gone at 14, her grandmother Dolores raised her in Bridgeport, surviving on a pension and night earnings from a laundromat. To cover the costs, Hazel took the evening shift at Southside Veterinary Clinic, a slot other students shunned for its 11 p.m. closing in a perilous neighborhood. On an October night, just before close, a woman in her 60s came in, carrying a cat. Silver hair cut short, a dark blue wool coat, and a voice edged with a faint rasp. The ghost, Hazel would later discover, of 20 years of cigarettes. The cat's ailment was a simple ear infection. The illness wasn't severe, but the woman lingered for another 45 minutes after the exam was done. She spoke to Hazel from the waiting room, just simple talk. As she left, her voice softened. "Thank you for your audience," hinting at a life starved of conversation. Her name was Renata Valente. Hazel's story halted as she watched Alio. He was stone still, hands gripping the table, his gaze locked. The next week, Renata came back, Hazel continued. No scheduled visit, no sick pet. She brought a box of homemade cannoli, claiming she'd made too many. She stayed for 2 hours, talking with Hazel in the lulls between appointments. Their pattern became a ritual. Every Tuesday evening, Renata would appear with pastries or coffee. She would settle in and tell tales of her youth in Sicily, of the husband she had lost, and of a son she adored but could no longer reach, lost as he was to the demands of his world. His life, she believed, had no room for the motherly care she yearned to give. Alio's name was never uttered, but they both knew. A muscle in Alio's jaw tightened, yet he let her speak. Hazel said Renata filled a space inside her she never knew was empty. Her grandmother, Dolores, offered love, but not the deep well of support she needed. Dolores was old and worn thin, too weary to be both a guardian and a sanctuary. Renata filled that role, not with grand acts, but simply by being there. She became the mother Hazel had lost at 14. Everything changed about 3 months before Renata died. She appeared at the clinic on the wrong day, her hands empty of their usual gifts. Her composure was shattered. She was tense, her eyes betraying recent tears. She spoke of a discovery about her son's business, something she couldn't tell him directly because trust inside his circle had been broken. She'd found a second set of books, she said, while cleaning Franco Bianchi's office over this weekend. The ledgers showed Franco was funneling hundreds of millions of dollars through their family restaurant. The money wasn't from the business. Its source was the Sinaloa cartel. She said she'd recorded 4 phone calls between Franco and cartel men on another device and found offshore accounts matching the transfers. She had copied everything to a hard drive. Renata gripped Hazel's hand then, instructing, "Keep this safe for me. Protect it with your life. Do not give it to anyone unless something happens to me. If it does, make sure Elio gets it." Hazel took the drive. 3 months later, Renata's car exploded in Lincoln Park. Hazel stopped, drawing a sharp breath. Beneath the table, Titan stirred, sensing the shift in her voice. "After she died," she went on, "I was lost in panic, paralyzed. Then the methodical assault started. 2 weeks after the funeral, the state health department hit the clinic with a surprise inspection. Their audit found a discrepancy in the stock of controlled opioids. The paper trail for the missing drugs pointed to Hazel's shifts, to her access codes. They accused her of stealing narcotics. Her license was gone in 48 hours. The university expelled her. With no money for a lawyer, her entire world crumbled in under 2 months. 3 years ago, they came for Titan, Hazel said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. 2 men forced their way into the room I was renting. They held me down and took him, without a word. It was the last warning. Stay quiet, or the next price would be higher. I understood the message, but I never got rid of the drive." Her eyes locked with Alio's. "For 5 years, I kept it safe, sewn into the lining of this coat, with me at all times. I lost everything, but I protected this because it was the only thing the woman who was my mother ever asked of me." A heavy silence fell after her story. Elio was frozen, his hands pressed to the table, his eyes seeing the wood grain, but not its pattern. In the corner, Tommy's gaze darted between them, waiting for a command that hadn't yet been formed. Then, Hazel stood. She shrugged off the large man's coat she had lived in for years and turned it inside out. A crude, hand-stitched seam ran along the lining, a stark contrast to the factory work. With her fingers, Hazel began to tear the threads apart. From the tear, she pulled a small external hard drive, sealed in a plastic bag yellowed with age. She set it on the table. Elio stared at the drive, a small, worn thing, yet he knew its contents held more weight than anything he had ever touched. He reached for it, and his hand trembled. Alio Valente, a name that struck fear across Chicago, showed a tremor holding this tiny plastic-wrapped thing. It held the proof, Franco's voice, his books, the final word that the man who pretended to mourn with him was his mother's murderer. He set the drive down gently, as if it might shatter, and sank into his chair without a word. Hazel sat again, too, granting him the silence to process the impossible. She didn't speak, didn't try to fill the space. She knew the quiet of a soul whose world had just been unmade. She had lived in a silence like that for 5 years. When Olio's head finally lifted, his expression was transformed. The shock had burned away, leaving a cold, hard focus that Tommy recognized instantly. His man straightened by instinct. Hazel's voice was level. "There is one last piece of intel. Franco knows you've reopened the investigation into your mother's death. Elio's eyes narrowed. Only his 3 private investigative teams and Tommy knew that. Hazel explained. Franco has someone inside your security. I don't know who, but my surveillance on him showed he gets constant detailed reports on your every move. Every new team you hired, Franco compromised them within 48 hours. He knew their every angle, erasing their leads before they could solidify. It wasn't a lack of proof, it was a systematic demolition of it. Alio's eyes found Tommy's. The color drained from Tommy's face as he gave a slight, desperate shake of his head, a silent plea of innocence. Alio's gut agreed. Tommy was still alive, which meant he was loyal, but that left 6 other men on his crew. Hazel went on. Franco is setting up your execution. She said it flatly, like a weather forecast. Not out of coldness, but because the constant threat of death no longer made her tremble. You're meeting a Russian investment group at Willis Tower next week. Franco arranged it. The plan is for it to look like an accident. I don't have the method, but I know he's talked to cartel contacts twice about it this month. Elio leaned back in his chair. 5 years. For 5 years, he had kept a silent vigil every Friday night, staring through a window, his gaze fixed on the man who killed his mother. For 5 years, every lead went cold. For 5 years, Franco stood by him, breaking bread, giving advice, wearing the name of brother. And for that entire time, every step Alio took was watched. Every search for the truth was smothered in its crib. The traitor was the man across the table in every meeting. The hand that steadied him when he wavered was the hand of his betrayer. Franco didn't just lie, he lived the lie every single day for 5 years, without a crack in the mask. Elio's gaze drifted from the drive to Hazel to the dog, Titan under the table. Then he gave Tommy a 2-word order: contact Mercer. They left the penthouse at 2 a.m. Elio wanted to move Hazel and Titan when the city was quietest, slipping past the cameras that would log a car's passengers. Tommy drove a clean black SUV, a ghost vehicle kept off the books for moments just like this. Hazel sat in the back, Titan's head a warm weight on her battered shoes. She asked nothing about where they were going. Her life was a map drawn by other hands. But this time, her keeper was the crime boss up front, his silence a stone wall for the entire 40-minute drive. 50 minutes north of Chicago, they entered Lake Forest, a town of secrets kept by high gates and ancient trees. Homes stood 100 meters apart, their owners bound by a code of silence. They turned onto an unlisted road, arriving at a safe house buried in a shell company that could stonewall the feds for months. The house was a 2-story gray stone monolith with ballistic windows, secured by a system Elio built 3 years ago for a day like this. 4 of Tommy's personal guards were already in place. Elio's main unit was compromised by an informant. Until the mole was found, Hazel's life was a secret held by a very small circle. Elio guided her inside, pointing toward a second-floor bedroom. His words were flat steel. "You will stay in this room. Guards are here 24/7. Tell Tommy if you need anything." He turned and walked away. Hazel stood in the doorway watching him go before she finally crossed into the space. Inside was a large bed draped in white linens, a window that looked onto the darkened garden, an empty closet, and a bath with a stone tub. Titan trailed her, settling by the bed and touching his nose to her foot. Hazel went into the bathroom, closed the door, and met her own eyes for the first time in an age. The reflection was sharper, more hollowed than she remembered. Her cheekbones cut shadows under her eyes, and her auburn hair was a matted wreck. The self-appraisal was fleeting. She turned on the shower, feeling the water transition from cold to warm, finally to a steaming heat that fogged the glass. She tested the torrent with her hand. 6 months. It had been 6 long months without this simple fire. The shelter's water was tepid, the showers cut to 15 minutes each, never enough to feel human. Before that, living rough, there was no water at all. She stepped into the spray and did not move. She just stood, letting the heat cascade over her, over every inch that had gone 3 years without care. For a full 30 minutes, she remained under the water as it stripped away the filth of the streets. The runoff carried away an exhaustion so deep she had no name for what was left behind. Emerging from the steam, her wet auburn hair clung to her skin, her eyes flushed from the warmth. Her expression had softened. It was not joy, but a profound relief, the release of a burden carried for an eternity. She put on the clothes laid out on the bed, a plain white t-shirt and cotton pants, but they were clean, new, and smelled of laundry. The moment she lay down, Titan rested his head on her legs. It was the same solid, warm pressure he had placed on Alio's shoes at Solace. This time, though, it was not born of exhaustion or need, but of peace. The animal had found his person, and his person was safe. For tonight, the constant state of alert could be lowered. Hazel placed her hand on Titan's head, closed her eyes, and sleep, real sleep, finally came for them both after 3 years. Alio came to Lake Forest every night. There was no warning, no schedule, he just appeared. After his work was done, he would drive north from the city alone, pulling into the garage around 8 or 9. Tommy warned him against traveling without security, but Alio waved off the advice. For Alio, some roads had to be traveled alone. The first night, they sat in the downstairs living room, a silent tableau, Hazel in one armchair, Alio on the opposite sofa, with Titan abridged on the rug between them. 20 minutes of quiet passed before Hazel broke the stillness. She was not answering a question. She was reading the room, his untouched whiskey, the far-off look in his gaze. She knew he was thinking of Renata. She sang in the kitchen, Hazel said, her voice soft. Alio's eyes snapped to hers. She went on, her tone intimate. Always the old songs. Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra. Songs she said her husband had loved. The tomato sauce was always fresh. She would not touch a can. And as it simmered, she would lean on the stove, ankles crossed, and hum, "That's amore," just loud enough to hear. Alio said nothing, but he put down his glass, his full attention now on her. It became their ritual. Every night, Hazel gave him another piece of his mother he never knew. The way she laughed at a terrible joke, a full-body tremor that shook her shoulders and squeezed her eyes shut for a whole minute. Every Sunday, she watched sentimental movies, weeping at the happy endings she knew were coming. If Hazel caught her, she would turn away, blaming the dust in the air, even in the middle of summer, and the way she talked about her son. Hazel had never heard a voice like it, a sound laced with pride, fear, and a deep longing all at once, as if he were across an ocean instead of a few miles away. Alio took it all in. His jaw tightened on certain words, then softened. He never wept, but Hazel saw his hand clench into a fist when a story revealed a truth he had been blind to. He had loved his mother forever, but this woman was a stranger. Renata humming to a simmering pot. Renata hiding tears over a film. Renata spending her Tuesdays in a vet's waiting room. So lonely she would talk to a 22-year-old kid. Hazel was showing him a new map of his own mother's heart. The truth was a blade that cut and sutured in the same motion. On their 4th night, Hazel pulled a black moleskin from her bag, its cover scarred and taped together. She set it on the table between them. Alio opened it to find 5 years of her life documented in careful script. Inside was a meticulous log of Franco's life, vehicle plates and their rotations, hand-drawn schematics of his haunts marking exits and cameras, and dossiers on a dozen of his regular contacts. A complete hand-drawn map of his money trail, pieced together from street-level surveillance and a hard drive she had memorized. She had hidden the drive's contents in the lining of her coat. Alio flipped through the pages, his face a mask. The intel was cold, precise, clinical, the work of a professional, not a victim. He raised his eyes from the notebook. "You did all this on the street." Hazel gave a small shrug. "Out there, if you do not watch, you die." Alio's gaze sharpened. 3 PI firms, 5 years, and hundreds of thousands of dollars had produced less than this. She had done it by herself, with no money, no tech, just her eyes and a cheap notebook. He shut the book and pushed it back across the table. No thanks were given. Alio did not speak that language. But the next night he returned and set a small box on the table. Inside was a dark brown leather collar with a steel buckle. Engraved on the inner band was a single word, Titan. He did not hand it to her, just left it on the table where the notebook had sat. A silent offering. Hazel opened it. Her fingers ran over the smooth leather, pausing at the engraved name. She said nothing, but she lifted her gaze to meet his. The look lasted only moments, but carried the weight of a long conversation. It was not just thanks. It was an acknowledgement. This man, a monster in the eyes of the world, had taken the time to have her dog's name carved into leather. It was not a play, not a move. He simply knew a name meant he belonged to someone, and she needed to know Titan would never be lost to her again. She buckled the collar around the dog's neck. He sniffed it, licked her hand, and lay down. The silence returned. But when Alio drove away, Hazel stood in the doorway to watch him go. And in his rear view, he saw her, a silhouette in the porch light with a hand on her dog's head. There was no word for what was growing between them. Not attraction, not affection. It was the quiet discovery of finding someone who knew your specific darkness, not by description, but by shared experience. On the 6th day, Conrad Mercer arrived at the house. At 62 years of age, his silver hair was shorn to the scalp, and his posture was so rigid he seemed to inhabit a uniform long since shed. 4 years post-retirement could not erase the palpable aura of his 28 years with the FBI, where he had commanded Chicago's war on organized crime and caged 3 cartel chiefs. Alio knew him through a single unspoken transaction. It was a Chicago understanding, the kind that blossoms when men on opposing sides of justice find their aims tragically aligned. Alio reached out to Mercer for one singular, desperate reason. Franco had a mole within the Chicago police. Any official channel was a trap. Mercer, however, existed outside that corruptible world. A man without masters, he was the only soul Alio knew who could orchestrate a surveillance mission entirely off the grid. Mercer, seated at the dining table in the Lake Forest estate, absorbed Alio's 15-minute briefing, then spent 20 minutes poring over Hazel's journal. He interfaced the hard drive with his own machine and for 45 minutes dissected its contents in silence. When he finally looked up, his face was a mask, but his eyes held a new predatory light. "This is enough," he stated. "We need nothing more." His gaze shifted to Hazel, who was across the room in an armchair, Titan at her feet. In a voice both dry and respectful, he said, "You've done more than half my old unit ever could, Miss Brennan." The plan was forged over the next 3 days. Mercer called upon a team of 4, all former federal agents like himself, untethered from the system or the city's police. The audio recorder was a piece of microtechnology the size of a shirt stud, able to capture a clear whisper from 15 meters in a closed space, its quality sufficient to stand in federal court. Alio would wear the first device on his lapel. Hazel was tasked with the second. Franco had scheduled the meeting with the Russian consortium for the following Tuesday night at Willis Tower, inside a private conference room on the 67th floor. Alio's role was to arrive on time, wear a mask of absolute normalcy, and betray nothing. Mercer had explained that men like Franco Bianchi possess a fatal need to display their power when they believe they have won. When he feels he has absolute control, facing the man whose life he is about to shatter, he will talk. They all do. It is not a choice but a sickness, born from 2 decades of being second, a desperate need for his victory to be seen, a need for the other man to witness his own complete and utter ruin. It was Hazel who solved the operation's greatest puzzle, smuggling the second device into the tower, bypassing all formal security. She turned to a page near the back of her journal, revealing a hand-drawn diagram of Willis Tower, mapped out during her hunt for Franco. Her finger traced a path to the mechanical level above the 67th floor, where the building's climate systems and ventilation network resided. An entry point lay hidden in a service stairwell on the east side, used by cleaning crews after 10 at night. She had memorized their entire routine from her long hours of observation. From that mechanical floor, ventilation shafts snaked between the levels, just wide enough for a person of her slender build to traverse. She would infiltrate before the meeting, situate herself in the ductwork directly above the room, and capture everything with the second recording device. If anything went wrong, her fail-safe was a satellite phone provided by Mercer. It was a ghost device that spoke directly to orbit, making it untraceable and impossible to jam. Mercer watched Hazel detail her infiltration. His gaze then shifted to Alio. Alio looked back at Hazel. She sat there, clutching that worn notebook describing a 70-story building's layout from pure memory. Her voice was unshakable, her eyes laser-focused, and he knew that anyone who could survive 5 years on the street with that kind of sharpness was either a prodigy or was fueled by something more powerful than the simple will to live. He knew what it was. A promise made to Ranata. Tuesday arrived with the evening. In his penthouse, Alio donned the charcoal 3-piece suit he wore only for battles of consequence. The recorder, a mere button, had been secured to his left lapel by Mercer that morning. He drove to Lake Forest one last time before the curtain went up. Hazel was waiting for him by the estate's front door. She was dressed with the shadows in black trousers, a dark, long-sleeved shirt, and the silent, soft-soled shoes Mercer supplied. Her hair was pulled back in a severe knot. She clutched the second recorder and the satellite phone. Titan stood beside her, his head at her hip, his dark brown eyes locked on Alio. "Are you afraid?" Hazel asked. "No." She held his gaze for a long moment, not to question his answer, but as if to burn his image into her mind. Should it be the last time? "I am," she said, "but I am going." Alio had already turned and moved 2 steps toward his car. He stopped, walked back to her, and cupped her cheek with his hand. His warm palm met her gaunt skin, his thumb brushing the bone beneath. He offered no words. Hazel did not flinch, did not close her eyes, did not move. She just stood there, letting his hand rest on her face for 3 or 4 seconds that held a meaning too deep for any words they were yet unable to speak. Then Alio's hand fell. He turned, entered his vehicle, and was swallowed by the encroaching night. At 9 p.m., Alio crossed the lobby of Willis Tower, wearing an expression he had taken 2 decades to perfect. a face that showed nothing. He wore a charcoal gray suit, a white shirt with no tie, and black Oxfords polished to a mere shine. The recording device, a whisper on his left lapel, was practically invisible. He shook the hand of the receptionist, ascended in the private elevator to the 67th floor, and as the doors opened, Franco Bianchi was there, waiting with a smile that Alio had once mistaken for the love of a brother. Franco was a portrait of himself, a perfect black suit, slick hair, a Patek Philippe watch adorning his wrist. His voice boomed with false warmth as he clapped Alio on the shoulder, claiming the Russians were on board and the South Loop Hotel would make them both legends. Alio returned a practiced smile, nodded, and shook hands with the three investors in the glass room overlooking the Chicago night. The meeting proceeded with a thin veneer of normalcy. Franco presented figures and strategies with a smooth, professional air, but Alio sensed a dissonance he would have once ignored. Franco's glances at his watch were too frequent, subtle flicks of the eye that betrayed a simmering anticipation. He was waiting for his cue. 2 stories above, inside the building's maze of ventilation shafts, Hazel was crawling. She had breached the perimeter at precisely 7 p.m., using an Eastern Service stairway, gaining the mechanical floor just ahead of the nightly security sweep. The ductwork was tighter than her drawing suggested. She moved through a tomb of absolute black, the only light coming in slivers from the vents below. The air was thick with the tang of metal and oil. Her progress was agonizingly slow, a quiet shuffle of elbows and knees, with every breath controlled to make no sound against the steel shell around her. When she had covered roughly 2/3 of the distance, she froze at a sound from directly below. It was the slow, measured pace of footsteps on tile, the signature of a security patrol, one of Franco's men. Hazel went utterly still, pressing her body flat against the bottom of the duct, her hands gripping the sides as she held her breath. The footsteps passed right under her. One upward glance from below, one scrape of metal, and the operation would be over. She counted in her mind 1, 2, 3, until she reached 40. The sounds receded into nothing. Hazel finally let out a slow, silent stream of air through her nose. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a drum beat so loud she feared it would echo through the metal. She forced herself to move again. Down below, on the 67th floor, the meeting concluded at 11 p.m. Farewells were exchanged. As the last Russian stepped into the elevator, Franco turned to Alio. The pleasant mask remained, but the light in his eyes had died. He suggested they talk privately in his office, mentioning a critical call he had to take. Alio knew this was the moment the script had foretold. He nodded, following Franco to the corner office, a simple room with an oak desk and windows facing west. Franco locked the door. The definitive click of the bolt was the same sound as his smile disintegrating. In that fraction of a second, the Franco of 20 years vanished, replaced by a cold, analytical stranger. His face became a void. From a desk drawer, Franco produced a handgun and pointed it at the center of Alio's chest. Alio did not react. In the darkness of the mechanical floor above, Hazel was in position, her device listening. Franco began to speak, and the words that came out were a torrent, a confession that signaled the final, catastrophic failure of a 20-year dam of resentment. He confessed to cleansing Sinaloa cartel money, a flood of hundreds of millions funneled through the hotels and properties they owned jointly. He spoke of raising this dark kingdom while Alio managed their sunlit world. The root of it all, he admitted, was jealousy. He had lived for 2 decades as a lesser man, simply Alio's Franco, 20 years watching the Valente name shine in print while his own became an afterthought. Then he mentioned Renata, his voice utterly devoid of feeling as he spoke her name. That complete absence of emotion was the most chilling sign of all. He described placing the bomb with the cold efficiency of a corporate negotiation. She discovered his books. She taped his conversations. She gave him no choice. It was, in his words, a necessary calculation. Elio stood like stone, hearing his brother confess to killing their mother. The confession flowed on. He named the traitor, Vince Darrow, a guard in Alio's security team turned by Franco 3 years prior. Every piece of intel on Alio's movements had come through him. Franco then brought up the vet girl, claiming the old woman gave her an item. He knew about her well before Darrow, from watching Renata's weekly visits to the clinic. He spoke of his methodical efforts to destroy her, but the target disappeared. For 2 years, his people found nothing. Franco offered a careless shrug. She was an obsolete factor now. He lifted the gun, its barrel centered on Alio's heart. His finger tightened, taking up the trigger's slack. His eyes held the look of a hunter that had already chosen its kill, now just savoring the last seconds. Elio stared down at the barrel of the gun. He then said with an unnerving stillness in his voice, "I know Hazel." Just 2 words. The name was a shock that shattered Franco's control. Blood fled from his face, leaving a mask of white. The pistol dipped 2 inches, a subtle but telling sign that Alio's verbal strike had found its mark. Before a word could form on Franco's lips, the office door swung inward. Hazel stepped inside. She seemed small, swallowed by the cavernous room and the tension within it, but she stood tall, her eyes unwavering, her right hand clutching a digital recorder. A single red light glowed, proof it held all 15 minutes of Franco's monologue. Behind her, Conrad Mercer and 4 armed ex-agents moved into formation. Mercer had listened to the entire scene unfold through a bug on Alio, waiting for the confession to be complete. Franco's eyes darted from Hazel to the recorder, then to the armed figures. In that instant, something inside Franco Bianchi broke. It wasn't regret, but the fury of a narcissist defeated by a woman he had written off as irrelevant. He swung the gun toward Hazel. Alio's body reacted before his mind could. A pure instinct honed over 2 decades where a moment's hesitation meant death. He slammed into Franco from the side, a shoulder-first tackle that sent them both crashing to the ground. The firearm skittered away across the polished floor. Elio subdued Franco, twisting his wrist into a lock and driving a knee into his shoulder. Franco thrashed wildly, but Alio's weight and the ice in his veins gave him absolute control. Mercer's men moved in, taking less than 3 seconds. One pulled Elio back as the other subdued Franco, binding his wrists. The metallic click of handcuffs cut the air. Franco started screaming, not begging, but vowing revenge. "You think this is over? The cartel won't let this go. You die. The girl dies. Everybody dies." His voice cracked, high and thin, the sound of a man completely unraveling. At Mercer's nod, the agents hauled Franco away, his curses echoing down the corridor, before the elevator doors slid shut, cutting them off. Alio got to his feet. His suit was a wreck, his hand throbbing from the collision. He stood in the middle of the office, breathing hard, his gaze finding Hazel. She hadn't moved from the doorway, still clutching the recorder, her frame trembling slightly. Her shoulders trembled, yet she didn't shrink away or fall. She stood her ground. In her eyes, Alio saw a reflection of himself, a deep, quiet letting go. For the first time in 5 years, a weight lifted from his soul. This wasn't a win, but an ending. At the same time, Tommy was handling the last loose end. Vince Darrow, the mole from the confession, was cornered by Tommy in a 65th floor corridor, just as he tried to make a phone call. Tommy had watched Darrow for the entire meeting. The moment Darrow lifted his phone, Tommy stepped out, snatched the device from his hand, and slammed him into the wall. Darrow didn't even try to fight. When he saw Tommy's face, he knew it was over. On the phone screen was the number for one of Franco's top men. Alia walked to Hazel. He stood before her, saying nothing. He gave one deliberate nod, a silent message she had learned to read perfectly. It was finally done. 4 months after Willis Tower, Alia watched from the 3rd row inside Chicago's Dirksen Federal Building. A federal courtroom has no drama, no spotlights, just tall ceilings, somber wood, the cold hum of fluorescent lights, and the heavy quiet of a room where sentences become cages. Franco Bianchi sat at the defense table, his fine suit traded for an orange jumpsuit, shackled between 2 U.S. Marshals. His eyes met no one's, not Alio's, not anyone's. His stare was empty, the look of a man who understood he had lost everything. Hazel sat next to Alio, her navy dress, neat hair, and new shoes, a testament to her healing. She was a world away from the woman found in the Englewood shelter 4 months prior. Her face was no longer drawn. The shadows beneath her eyes were gone. But the real change was in how she held herself. Her back was straight, her shoulders squared, a posture that claimed space instead of apologizing for it. She no longer tried to make herself small. Then she did something she hadn't in 4 months. She reached out and took Alio's hand, an act born of her own will. She just laid her left hand over his right, and his fingers closed around hers in response, holding firm. The trial had lasted 3 weeks. Every piece of digital proof that Renata had gathered, that Hazel had protected for 5 years, was laid bare for the court. The false ledgers, the taped calls between Franco and the Sinaloa cartel, the details of Cayman Islands accounts, and the recording from Willis Tower. It all became official evidence. When Franco's confession filled the room, describing the car bomb that killed Renata, Alio felt Hazel's fingers tighten around his. Neither of them looked at the other. The connection through their hands was enough. The investigation that followed uncovered a web of corruption on a staggering scale. 14 offshore accounts, 6 dirty Chicago cops, and 2 health department officials, one of whom had destroyed Hazel's career. Even a state judge was on payroll. The federal indictment was more than 200 pages long. The night before the verdict, they ate at the Lake Forest estate. Hazel just pushed food around her plate with a fork, a sure sign that nerves had stolen her hunger. Alio saw it and remained quiet. He knew by now that with Hazel, waiting was more powerful than asking. "What if they dismiss my testimony?" she finally whispered, her eyes on her plate. "They have already validated it," Alio answered. "Your testimony was compelling." "But what if it's not enough?" Alio stopped eating and looked at her. "Regardless of the outcome, you exposed the truth. That act itself is sufficient." Hazel gave a slow nod and kept moving the food on her plate. Alio said nothing more. The quiet between them had become its own language, and he knew some things didn't need words. Titan, the dog, slept by their chairs, his head on Hazel's feet, as they sat in silent communion until at last she took a small bite. The next day, in the Dirksen building, the judge read every charge in a flat, steady voice, the exact sound of justice being served. Guilty of intentional first-degree murder, guilty of federal money laundering, guilty of conspiracy. The sentence was life imprisonment without parole. Hazel's hand tightened in Alio's. There was no joy in the moment, no victory. Only the heavy, final piece of justice done. Leaving the courthouse, Alio drove north by himself. He didn't tell Hazel where he was going. She didn't ask. Rose Hill Cemetery sits in a quiet part of North Chicago, its old trees hiding the city beyond, its walkways empty on a weekday afternoon. Alio left the car a block from the entrance and walked, needing the slow journey to prepare himself for something he hadn't been able to do in 5 years, to speak to his mother, free from the crushing weight of her murder. Renata's headstone was a simple stone. A slab of pale granite bore her name between 2 dates. Beside it, a fresh bouquet stood sentinel. Simple white daisies from a local market, modest but vibrant. He recognized Hazel's touch. She had asked him to wait at the gates 3 days before. He hadn't asked why. Now, before his mother's final resting place, a gentle wind stirred the petals. His words were a murmur meant only for the stone. He spoke Franco's name the first time it had passed his lips here. The truth was a heavy thing, he admitted, but it had to be carried. He confessed that truth, for all its pain, was the only solid ground. He spoke of Hazel, calling her remarkable. He detailed her 5 years of loyalty to a promise, even after it cost her everything, her home, her name, her future. She had the silent strength Ranata always prized. He swore he was protecting her, and always would. Then, only silence. The wind whispered through the daisies as a bird sang from a distant branch. Alio drew in a slow, deep breath, the first real one in weeks, feeling it expand his ribs and flood his lungs. Turning from the grave, a tangible burden lifted from him. The ache wasn't gone. Grief never vanishes so easily, but a distinct, unnamed pressure had eased. 6 months after the verdict, an envelope with the Illinois Department of Health seal arrived at the Lake Forest estate. At the kitchen table, Hazel slit the envelope open. Titan lay at her feet. Alio sat opposite with his coffee. She read the document twice, then set it down. Her face was a mask of calm, but her hands held a fine tremor. Her license to practice was restored. The 5-year-old accusation of opioid theft was gone, erased after 2 federal officials tied to Franco were prosecuted. Hazel Brennan's professional life was clear again. Her eyes met Alio's. No words of praise were exchanged, no declarations that it was over. He just offered a single, deliberate nod, a silent language she now understood as his complete validation. 3 months on, Hazel opened a new animal clinic on the south side. It wasn't a wealthy neighborhood, nothing like the Gold Coast or Lincoln Park. She chose the exact street of her old practice, where she'd worked nights, where Renata Valente had first walked in with a cat and cannoli. It was a conscious act of taking back her past. Alio understood without her saying a word. At the same time, Alio began a process he never imagined, making his business legitimate. It was a gradual shift, moving funds from shadow economies into lawful ones. He launched the Renata Valente Foundation, offering legal aid to falsely accused women and free vet care to places like the South Side and Inglewood. The foundation had been Hazel's idea. One afternoon, driving past the Englewood shelter, she saw a young woman on the pavement with a sickly cat. For 10 minutes, she watched silently, her eyes fixed on the scene. Then she spoke. She pointed out her own fortune, noting others didn't have a guardian like Alio Valente. His reaction was delayed but immense. He told his lawyer to create a foundation. Later, Hazel arrived at the penthouse with her veterinary certificate, framed and sealed by the state of Illinois. She set it on the kitchen table, her eyes flicking to Amelia in a familiar, silent request for approval that he recognized. He gave her the praise she sought. After a moment, she asked for a fridge magnet, a simple inquiry that made no sense to him at all. Hazel explained a childhood ritual. Her grandmother Dolores would display good report cards on the fridge, held by cheap plastic magnets from the market. Fruit shapes, or an Illinois outline that cost $2. It was Dolores's way of showing her pride. The next day, Alio drove to the Maxwell Street Market and bought a cheap, plastic, Illinois-shaped magnet. Back at the penthouse, he used that $2 magnet to fix Hazel's certificate to the $15,000 Sub-Zero refrigerator. Hazel just watched the document hanging on the gleaming appliance. Then a laugh escaped her. It was not a small, controlled sound. It was a full-body event, her shoulders shaking, her eyes squeezed shut. It lasted for nearly a full minute, a sound she once described as being like Renata's. For Alio, it was the first time he had witnessed such raw emotion from Hazel. It was wild and uncontained, and to him, it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in recent memory. The dog, Titan, was their constant bridge. He would lie on the sofa between them as they discussed the nightly news. The dog went with Alio to Solace each Friday, settling on a mat Tommy kept for him in the corner. He would also go to the clinic with Hazel each morning, lying in the reception area with his head on his paws, impassively watching patients arrive and leave. Local kids often stopped by, not for their pets, but simply to touch the large dog. On one Saturday evening, Alio and Hazel were on the penthouse terrace. Before them, the Chicago skyline glittered, a postcard of amber lights against an endless dark. But a picture can't capture the feeling of the October wind or the particular scent of the city at night. Dinner was over. Titan slept under the table, his head on Hazel's foot, the exact spot he'd claimed since his return. Alio's eyes were on Hazel as she gazed at the city, the wind catching in her auburn hair. He decided she was most beautiful when she was unaware he was watching. He reached into his jacket, produced a small velvet box, and placed it on the table between them. Hazel's gaze shifted from the box to him. "My mother used to say something," Alio began, his voice deeper than usual. "She said when you find the person who makes you want to be a better man, you don't let them go. I failed to tell my mother I loved her one last time. I won't make that mistake again." Hazel opened the box. Inside was not the huge diamond one might expect from a Chicago crime boss. It was white gold with a single elegant stone. Alio chose it because it was like Hazel. Its value was intrinsic, not for display. Hazel looked at the ring, at Alio, then at the sleeping dog at her feet, and said, "That starving animal collapsed in front of you and led you to me." "Maybe Ranata sent him," Alio said, and then he smiled. It was the first real one in 5 years, reaching his eyes. Not just a social gesture. He thought he'd lost the ability for that expression the night he saw the burnt frame of his mother's car in Lincoln Park. "Yes," he said. Hazel slipped the ring onto her own finger. The dog, Titan, slept on, oblivious. He didn't need to know. His work as a catalyst was done, beginning the night he stumbled into Solace and collapsed before the one person who needed to be found. The woman who was a transient with a hidden past, and the crime lord who ritually sat alone each Friday staring at an absence. The two of them came together because a starving dog chose the perfect place to fall. A powerful love does not simply end. It transforms, and it always returns to where it began. The central lesson of this file might not be about organized crime or betrayal. It may be about post-traumatic growth, how positive change can stem from intense suffering. That courage isn't having no fear, but acting while you feel it. That family bonds are not just blood, but are forged when a stranger shows you their deepest vulnerability. That resolution can take time, but is possible with persistence. And that love, no matter how suppressed by trauma, has a powerful will to return. If this analysis has moved you, please show your support. Consider sharing this case study with someone you care for, or one who needs reassurance that a good outcome is possible. Subscribe for daily case file releases. I am most interested in your emotional response to this narrative. Which moment had the strongest impact? Do you believe such catalysts exist in our dysfunctional world, that there are dogs who find the right people, or Hazels who keep promises after losing all, or Alias who find feeling after years of being closed off? Please leave a comment with your thoughts. I read every submission and appreciate the data you provide. I wish all of you continued good health, life satisfaction, and psychological peace. Thank you for your time. This concludes the session. I will see you for the next case file.